Okay, so The Guardian have finally caved. Huh. So The Guardian's editorial view yesterday, The Guardian's view is that women are allowed to discuss the rule of law that they're not aware of, and that it might be a bit more complicated than they originally thought. So, I've always been a Guardian reader, did you know that? My whole life. I started reading The Guardian when it was a big inky fingers broadsheet. I carried on reading it when it was a Berliner. I was still buying the Observer on a Sunday as a weekly, just routine in 2010. I used to use The Guardian to look for jobs on a Wednesday, Society Guardian. And then I learned my lesson. Now, the rule of law that I represent is the evolving rule of law of the 20th century. It's our evolving understanding of power dynamics, of male violence, of abuse, of institutional failure, and how all this comes together to kind of develop systems. Now, in order to start developing this knowledge, what we had to abandon, what we had to have, was what happened in 1945, which was an evolution in citizenship. So no longer did we have a class of people who were our representation, who we were reliant on for charity. The rule of law applied to us. And I personally am a product of a very late evolution in that, which is the looked after child, and the children that I'm talking about are that. So the rule of law is bigger than The Guardian. These laws are ours. But The Guardian have always claimed a voice for these systems, and for 30 years these systems have been decimated to absolute silence by a continual policy reflex. And what The Guardian have been kind enough to reveal is when they say in 2018, the problem is a bit more complex than we thought, and women should be allowed to discuss the rule of law without being assaulted, abused and targeted, what they're saying is that this is the first time that they've ever heard about these systems or these considerations, and they're being honest. Because The Guardian have existed in a world where they could project out an identity, and we didn't question it. But then you add a social dimension to that political communication, and all of a sudden the tension between their function and their identity has been exposed, and they've been playing it out for 8 years. And their identity is as our representation, but that has not existed in this country since 1945. And the reason that they do not know this is because over the last 30 years, elite social closure has occurred, which is where rich people take shit. And so The Guardian exists at the centre of a political culture of think tanks and a political party. And they genuinely believe that in a digital environment where people can publish on their own and bypass them, as I am doing, that they can continue that. No, they did not understand that this other dimension had been added to communication. And what they have been doing is playing out the narcissistic reflex. The I identify as your sex comes from exactly the same place as I identify as your representation. It's the same structures, the same academic disciplines feeding it, the same class. And yesterday they admitted that they don't know about these systems. Well, I already knew about that. Now, in 2010, when they were faced with the rule of law being undermined for everybody, for every woman in this country, for child protection, for all those vulnerable people contained within local authorities, they thought the question was whether they thought we were deserving. They do not understand that there is no such position available in this political economy, and that the rule of law is what they will abide by. They do not understand the tension between that identity, where they identify as people's representation, and the actual rule of law and actual power dynamics that people are living with. And as a consequence, they have just spent 8 years trying to decimate those systems. And in doing so, they have revealed that their class has taken over our trade unions, our political party, and that we have no representation. And what they have also shown is that to uphold that disenfranchisement, they will abuse people and unleash physical abuse and violence. And what they are in is a narcissistic shit show on Twitter, and anybody going near that is at risk, especially if they have children, or if they are somebody where The Guardian identifies as their representation. And my blog's an 8-year record of the gaslighting that came from that culture, because I said, no, you're not my representation, without asking me. No, you don't have the right to abuse me. No, you don't have the right to target me. I'm not connected with you, and the only relationship I should have with you is as buying your newspaper or you earning my vote. Now, the levels of misogyny and elitism at The Guardian are deeply dysfunctional, and they have basically survived for about 30 years by being the foil for the right. So they are fed entirely. So they're like, their outrage is what the Daily Mail relies on. Now, the problem is that this little culture are currently performing the function of a blockage in our democracy at a point where we are very vulnerable to actual fascism. And we are not just vulnerable to fascism from the right, although that is a very real threat, and we have to be very clear about what the far right are exploiting. We also now face a direct threat of fascism from the left. And Corbyn will double down on self-ID because it's a narcissistic culture, and anybody with any sense will use that and understand they've isolated themselves and the centre position can form away from them. But that kind of has to happen away from The Guardian. Now, The Guardian have left themselves without function during a period where we're redefining institutions, and they've stated quite clearly that they have no awareness of these institutions. And I'm grateful for that. And they have broke this spell that they had where they could claim to be a voice for the voiceless by unleashing abuse on the voiceless to show that what they actually are is the organisation who try to keep people silent. They used to recruit people suffering austerity and tell them that they could only get paid if they were abused below the line, and then the abuse would come in the form, as a reflection of their culture. And they believe that as long as they identify as good, whatever they do is alright. And this country is on the verge of fascism. 100,000 people have just died because of austerity, at least. And the rule of law was just undermined to the point where this country is now deeply unstable, and they don't know how to take responsibility for that. So instead, we get a piss-weak editorial saying, we think in 2018 that women should be allowed to discuss the rule of law. Well, here's what else we're allowed to discuss. We're allowed to discuss whether a dying newspaper run by trust fund have any function at all. We're allowed to discuss the abusive behaviour of The Guardian in asserting themselves as a mediator in democracy that does not exist in this country. We can discuss the hold that culture has over think tanks, a political party and media, and the impact on the rest of us. We can discuss the people who died and the people who were directly abused so that The Guardian could sell austerity. We can discuss why it is that they can only see elite offspring and they can't see the society that they appear to be the voice for. And we can discuss that while their fucking trust fund runs out. But in the meantime, we're in a race against time. Because basically the biggest hope that this country has of avoiding fascism is if the fucking Guardian's trust fund runs out. So I don't really give a fuck what The Guardian think anymore. I'm really, really glad that they have revealed that they believe women should be able to discuss the rule of law, but we already could. And in 2010, when the rule of law was undermined for British women and British children, all they could see was whether the poor are fucking deserving. When Gary Dean, a prolific paedophile, broke into little girls' houses and traumatised them and then starved himself to get access to vulnerable women, he's fucking Nelson Mandela on a hunger strike. You present them with a paedophile or an attempted murderer, they'll think this is the fucking civil rights matter of the decade. You face them with 100,000 people dying and equality being rolled back for actual women and children. We'll decide whether those people are deserving at some point. Well, here's what you did, Guardian. You moved into a chat room and you sold a policy reflex that killed 100,000 people. And that can't be undone. I would start making amends quite soon. And the amends you need to start making is P45s going around your fucking offices. You need to ditch comment. You need to ditch your actual identity, which is false, and a legacy identity from 1945. And you need to start doing journalism again while you still can and while people will buy your fucking paper. Because I'll be honest with you, I've got a bottle of whiskey upstairs, and the day you go under, I'm going to get very happily drunk with a couple of friends of mine.